for it.
Okay, well, thank you, team, and all other organizers for putting together this excellent symposium sessions. And it's a great pleasure to participate in this symposium. And thank you to all other participants and listeners, whoever, are tuning in and so on. So in this presentation, we'll talk about different economic tools that can be used for conservation and to make more sustainable use of the common property resources and so on. So I'm Mozumder. I teach at Florida International University in Miami. I have a joint appointment with Earth and Environment and Economics. This work is a joint effort with my students, Anderson, Eric, they're graduate students at FIU, and another colleague, David Bray. He's an anthropologist. He's working in community forestry in Mexico for pretty much throughout his life, last 30, 40 years. So it's an interdisciplinary collaboration, and you'll see what we are discussing about how we can use some economic tools that used other context and so on, but not so much in conservation context, and to see if it can produce some more sustainable outcome to, for conservation purposes. So one of the tools that, frequently discussed, payment for environmental service. A lot of environmental services and goods are, produced in different scale, different location. People who provide the service or produce the service, sometimes they are in upstream. But if they don't do certain things, don't maintain water quality or land uses and so on, it affects downstream peoples in a very adverse way. And on the other hand, upstream folks don't have enough incentive to do things that will increase the livelihood security or economic well-being in downstream. So how do we find a way that can create some incentive mechanisms so upstream people do more environmentally benign activities? So the idea is, think about a situation where if they use the fishing or water in a certain way that produces benefit for them, but it produces some negative outcome for downstream people. For example, if they're overfishing or dumping things in the water, that fishermen downstream might be adversely affected. But the idea is to create some payment mechanism, which probably somewhere in between. So if you see the red blocks and these green blocks, if you can convince upstream people, hey, you do certain things and we'll pay you this much, which is less than the negative outcome that happens to the downstream, the idea is, they probably will be open to some win-win combination of this mechanism. But in general, this is the payment for, so it's basically a contract between upstream, downstream, or a different location, different groups of people. You come up with some sort of contractual mechanism to make them either in terms of land use or water quality or, different things that you want them to behave in a certain way. We are using something conservation auction mechanism. Auction mechanism is widely used in different market setups in economics and finance and so on, but not so much in conservation context. Some recent practice in the US and Australia, they are trying something, but not so much in developing countries. We are trying to see, in developing countries where ecosystem services are very critical, they affect people's lives and livelihoods in a big way. Resource, they don't have much resource to conserve. On the other hand, you don't have much institutional setup to organize people's behavior and so on. So we feel like, developing countries should get a lot of attention to see if some of these tools can be applied. So we look into different contexts and we decided to try out this idea in Mexico, where they have a good history of practicing and payment for environmental service program, but not in the way that we are discussing, not any conservation auction or any other mechanism. It's basically a government program. You take it or leave it. They will give you certain uh, payment per hectare per year, and if you agree to do conservation activities on the land, you get the money. If you don't get the money, and so on. So it's take it or leave it. But conservation auction is something a little bit different than that, and you'll see in a few minutes. We'll go quickly over this. In economics, we talk about contract theory, and so there basically we are saying contract theory can be extended, and these types of auction can be use different platform, different mechanism can be tested. So there might be a good way to expand economic theory and also field experience, field experiment to test different mechanisms. In the Mexican context, as I said, Mexico has a large PS program for more than 2 decades. And so that's why we thought, this new tool it would be a good idea to test it in Mexico. And so we are trying to implement this conservation auction mechanism for a number of contexts. Mexico has a long history, almost more than 2 decades, of something called payment for hydrological services. And in that program, the residents, villagers, people who live in the forested lands, they get some payment, 30 to 40 dollar per hectare per year. And if you agree to participate in the program, you get that money, and you are obligated to conserve the land in a certain way. They will give the details. You cannot cut the trees on those lands, cannot do pasture or grazing, and so on and so forth. So we will try to see if the auction mechanism can be applied to that program, existing program, which is now give it or take it program. And then several other programs. In Nicaragua, there is a silvipastoral program. Basically, you plant trees on land, you forest plants, and so on. In Indonesia, there is a land erosion, soil erosion program in the coffee farms. So since Mexico has a lot of coffee activities, coffee farming, we wanted to implement that program. And then carbon capture program. Basically, these are much more mature, timber, forest, and so on. And other places of Mexico, they have some programs, and we wanted to try it in Oaxaca, where we are implementing this program. So as you can see, these are the maps for payment for hydrological services. They have 2 different categories. They get $40 per hectare for cloud forest. These are high elevation forest, and then $30 per hectare all other forest. Almost, this is a little bit dated information, but now more than $500 million has been disbursed through these programs. It has been started by CONOFOR, which is the main forest agency of the government. And the payment for hydrological service has been quite successful in terms of producing the services that it's intended to, and also make it sustainable in terms of getting the fund to the indigenous communities who are living in the forested land. So we picked 8 villages in 5 different communities in Oaxaca, Mexico. And the reason you're familiar with these communities in terms of our connections, and we have group members who worked on those communities before, and so on. And these places, forests are managed as a common property. So individual resident citizen doesn't have exclusive ownership over their land. It's a community-owned land, and so on. And they are called right holders. So they have the right to use the forest lands. They have a committee who can sign contract with other agencies, how to manage the land use, and so on. But they cannot do much individually. So you can see our communities in the Oaxaca here. Size of the, shows that how big are these communities or how small. And so these are small communities in the foothill of forest, and very difficult terrain, and so on. and most of the activities they do, and you can see some bird's eye view from these communities from far away and so on. And you can see very good dense forest cover. So this gives a snapshot of the program in these communities. As I said, 5 different communities. You can see the area, the forest, percentage of forest, how much percentage is under PES contract. This is total mountain cloud forest, high elevation forest versus a regular forest. And so, it has a mix of combination. And main activities the community members they do in these areas, mainly they rely on milk agriculture, which is basically subsistence agriculture, corn, and they do cattle. You can see that average ownership of 9 cattle and so on. They do pasture and maintain forest plants in their pasture. Some of them also do coffee farming. And for coffee farming, it's like a 1.8 hectares average coffee farmlands. Another, and they do soil erosion control in their coffee land. Another activities, economic activities is, it's migration. So basically, the activities that, for example, coffee generates a good deal of revenue. If the coffee market is not doing good, is down, a lot of times, they switch to migration. They try to come to US to do work and so on. And so that's another economic activities. And overall, we did survey these community peoples and understand that they have a desire to participate more on conservation activities, and they feel like they deserve more compensation for the conservation activities they do. So in our conservation auction mechanism, we implement, as I say, 4 different conservation auction. Soil erosion. First one is payment for hydrological service, and the second one is silvipastoral programs. Third one is soil erosion, and fourth one is carbon capture in the matured forest. We selected, field assistant from local schools, and we give them a bid structure from 100 to 1,600 pesos, which is, almost 4 times than what they are getting now. For example, now they are getting $40 per hectare per year and so on. And basically in this auction mechanism, they submit their desired price, how much they will accept for different conservation activities per hectare per year. And there is a mechanism whether their bid can be accepted or rejected. And if it gets accepted, they sign the contract and they'll get the payment, and so the auction mechanism we use is called BDM auction mechanism, which is quite used in economics and finance literature. It has been considered as an incentive compatible mechanism. But basically, we generate a price from our auction price, what we call is through our bingo case. And if that price is less than or equal to the price they submit, it gets accepted. If their price is higher than our auction price, their bid gets rejected, and so they don't do anything, they don't get paid anything. So that's the bottom line. So here you can see we tried this, I don't know, you can see my. So here we allowed some sessions, we allowed communication, and NC means no communication, C means communication. So PES, existing PES, and we wanted to see if we allow them to discuss whether it gets changed their bid structure. This is existing PES, this is silvipastoral, this is soil erosion control, this is carbon capture. And you can see in the first 2 auction mechanism, actually letting them to discuss with each other did not change much the mean bid amount. For erosion control and carbon capture, it did. So in the erosion control, after allowing them communication, it went less. So one hypothesis that probably since they are doing a good deal of erosion control on their coffee land, they thought, well, you know, we are doing it anyway, so we probably can provide that service with a much less compensation. Carbon capture, we see the opposite. Since carbon has a global market and a lot of NGOs goes to these communities and try to have them sign different contract and different obligation, different time period and so on, they thought, well, it has a global demand, they probably can command a higher price. Anyway, then we compared these things with how much under given. So as I said, you know, current Mexican PS, it's give or take program. If you participate, you get $30 or $40 per hectare per year. If you don't, then you don't get don't get paid, and you don't provide this conservation service. You can have more flexibility. How do you use the land? So we compare, you know, how much it costs now and how much it will cost if we implement the auction mechanism across these 4 different ecosystem services. So if Mexico implements the auction mechanism in the PS program they have now, it will cost them more money because the villagers, and it's also consistent with the survey we have done, they think, you know, they are not getting paid enough. They, you know, their willingness to accept bid is higher. So it will cost, if you implement the auction mechanism, it will cost more. On the other hand, the new program, silvipastoral coffee erosion carbon forestry, that doesn't exist in the community now, and looks like this mechanism can be implemented in a much more economic efficient way. Basically, the cost will be less if you do through the auction mechanism. And so on. So that's pretty much the auction. So they have, you know, the community offers opportunities to extend these different PS program beyond what they have, and so it can be, you know, it can be extended in that way. Now I'll discuss a second part of this research project. Actually, we are engaging with the communities in different land use activities, and we are designing some sort of a game, conservation game, where they are eligible for different level of payments depending on what kind of land use practices they do individually and as a group. So so as I said, you know, the land use, they don't own the land, but as a community, they assign the land to the right holders. You have these 2 acres of land, or you have this 3 acres of land, and they can get to decide whether they will do coffee or cattle grazing or other types of agriculture, corn and so on. So they have those flexibility and through the community. So what we do here, we design different treatments. So in the beginning, they have the decision to make either cattle, pasture or conservation. And they play it for 10 rounds. Each round we describe them as an year, and they get paid some money for doing conservation, similar to payment for hydrological service. And then participants show, you know, what was their land use decision, is it conservation or cattle pasture? And if they try to maximize their individual payoff, you know, cattle pasture has a higher return, so they can make more money. But as a collectively, you'll see in a next slide or so, as a collectively, they lose money. And also, if they're doing cattle more and more round after round, the soil quality get degraded, and you know, so in the long run, they lose money. So they cannot, you know, so there is a trade-off between group versus individual. There are a trade-off between a short run and long run benefit they can extract from the land use. In the next treatment, we say that, well, if you do 10 rounds of conservation, you will become eligible for another PS, which we'll call carbon sequestration. So if you do conservation, you did not cut the trees, tree gets bigger and so on, that stores carbon, and you know, that make them eligible for a different PS. On the other hand, if they do continue to cattle grazing, and that degrades the land quality and so on, so their payment goes down. So that's another bundling mechanism that we implement. And then in the next treatment, we bring another bundling. We say, okay, after 10 rounds, you did this, so you become eligible for carbon sequestration. But if you even keep doing conservation more after 20 rounds, then you become eligible for another payment for environmental service, which is biodiversity conservation. So think about, if you did not cut the trees for 20, 30 years, tree gets bigger, it becomes habitat for other species, birds and animals and so on, which has ecological value, and they become, they are eligible for another PES program. So this is how we bundle different types of things and so on. And then if they keep doing cattle and pasture, their payment goes down and down because soil quality gets degraded and further and so on. And then we bring this last treatment where actually this is a treatment as we did in the first treatment one. We take off all the extra payment that we offered and basically bring it back to the original situation and see, going through these conservation exercises, different payments and so on, what happens if we take up these payments, incentives, because that's what happens. A lot of development programs, they offer incentive for 5 years, 10 years, and then after they leave and there is no incentive. We want to see that, whether they go back to their original or they still are practicing conservation. So here you can see how a treatment design, basically here in the first, either cattle or pasture conservation, you get some payment. If you keep doing conservation, then it will take you to 10 collective conservation decision, make you eligible for another PES. Even if you keep doing more conservation, that will make you eligible for biodiversity and so on, and so forth. So that's how. And when you see the payment structure, that will give you probably a better idea. Oops. In the beginning, it's for conservation, they get 350 points. It's basically equivalent to, you can think of $1. And if everybody did conservation, they get 1,400 as a group. One did, pasture and another did conservation. They get a different amount because, pasture has a higher returns and so on. So this is the way it works. But if they're doing more conservation, they get a different types of payment structure. It gets 450. So it's a additional payment for carbon sequestration. So they are now every conservation gives them 450 points. On the other hand, if they're doing cattle, they're from 350, they go to 250 and so on. So this is like a more land degradation reflecting. And here you get the whole picture, how the, things, so it starts from 350. If you do more conservation, 10 rounds, you get 450. If you even do 20 rounds, you get 550. On the other hand, if you are doing 20 cattle, your payment becomes less, 250. And then if you are doing 20 rounds of cattle grazing and pasture, it gets 150. So it has a short-term and long-term trade-offs from the land use and so on. So we wanted to see, we presented this game and see how they play this game. Do they always, trying to instantly maximize their profit, or they are trying to bundling, because 550 is a lot more than 350. They are trying to bundle everything together and so on. We try to compare, which treatment gives the maximum score per treatment. And so the number one is just the treatment one. No bond, just a payment for hydrological service. Number two is the PES, hydrological plus carbon sequestration. Number three, hydrological plus carbon sequestration plus biodiversity. And the number four one is the same as number one. We take off all the additional incentives and come back to the original. So few things to notice here. So actually people don't, since number three is bundling three different services, offering a lot more benefit from conservation, still people do not prefer that bundling mechanism. Basically, you are asking them to sign much more long-term contract, 20 rounds and so on, and they don't feel comfortable in, participating in a very long-term contract that will make them binding to, restrict their land use and so on. two bundling payment for hydrological plus carbon sequestration looks much more preferred, and that generates higher score. So bundling two service is more preferred than bundling three service, even though it generates more benefits and revenues because it also obligates them into long-term contract. On the other hand, when we took off all the additional incentives for second and third PES, and 4 and 1 in terms of design feature is pretty much same, but we see that people are still doing more conservation than what we observe in the first treatment. So basically, the implication is that if you offer them incentive to do conservation and they go through this process, they understand the benefit of conservation, and if you take up the incentive at some point, still they value the conservation and just don't come back to the original, or sometimes they get fed up and they don't even do less than beginning. But that's not what's happening. They value the conservation. There are some behavioral implication that they are participating and doing more conservation than what they used to do in the first treatment. Anyway, so some of the preliminary findings that conservation auction, there is a potential to apply these things in Mexico and elsewhere, and we try to extend it to different programs that are existed in different parts of the world, but not as an auction mechanism. So auction mechanism may work well in this developing country context. Another thing is the bundling mechanism, different payment for different service we want people to provide. We have to give them additional incentives, but a lot of times if you're making too many programs, it's very difficult to keep track of things. So bundling might be more feasible contractual mechanism to incentivize them and provide these services. But there is a limit. You cannot bundle 10 different things into the contract and cannot expect them to participate, because they have different plans or things and with their land and so on. So looks like there are some additional bundling can happen, but probably not too many, that especially that will obligate them to long-term contract with their land use. And that's given said that most of the places you see this PES program, but it's implemented as a take it or leave it. The community doesn't have any say about what is their preferred price and so on. This auction mechanism gives a way to much more participatory approach, that you are asking their preference, how much they will be willing to accept for this land to conserve and so on, and you have a mechanism to either accept that bid or reject the bid. So it has a participatory process. They feel like they are participating in the mechanism rather than just giving them a blind offer and have them either accept it or reject it. So they like that approach, and communities are interested in extending the PES program. And so these innovative economic tools might be generate some local interest, some sort of they have some say in the process, and make this can make this PES program more sustainable. You can see some of the picture of the villagers where this is a local school field where we did this auction and game, land use game, common pool resource game, and so on. And you can see they are changing their yellow card and blue card, yellow for cattle, blue for conservation, and they're bringing their card and they're getting paid and so on. So it was good, a lot of fun and so on. And we wanted to do more probably down the line.